Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am Reverend Bob Moore. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Peace Action, and we're very pleased that you're joining us tonight for this Earth Week event. We have a wonderful speaker that we'll be calling on shortly, but first we wanted to give you some background about we as a anti-nuclear and peace organization have started working on the interrelationship of those with the climate crisis. And we started doing that in 2015. And a person who was a co-founder of this No Wars, No Warming campaign under our umbrella is going to begin our evening with a video presentation on our No Wars, No Warming campaign, and that is Ed Aguilar. And Ed has been on our staff out of our Philadelphia office since 2012. So we're honored to have Ed do this brief presentation to start us out. Go ahead, Ed.
Oh, okay. Well, we started No Wars, No Warming as a campaign in 2015. And I do want to give credit to Alessia Vega, who was the regional assistant director at that time and who played a large part co-chairing with me and really got things going in 2015. Let's go to the next slide. And there is, in fact, Alessia and I. You can see the young woman in the sunglasses. That's me over here. Here's our coalition banner. And that was the People's Climate March. And we all went to New York City, and you may remember that was a very large march. There's some of our board members. Carol Allen is here. Ram Shachiluri, we could go on. People from our Camden group. Here we are at the Democratic National Convention, which was held in Philadelphia, remember, in 2016. And again, here we have Alessia, Mark Tolo, our vice president, and you know, a large contingent. That was about a 10,000 person march. This was organized in Bucks County, and then we went to Washington. Many also went to Washington in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. We're fighting against the Keystone XL pipeline, and that went back and forth. Obama did not approve it. Trump did. Biden has again stopped it. So we'll see where that goes. And in 2019, we got involved. Our student chapter at St. Joseph's University helped to spearhead our work on the part of the global climate strike march. You remember that was started by Greta in Sweden, but spread around the world. And so these are students for a livable future over here. Next, please. Then the other thing that was organized, and this was Kathy Leary was instrumental, one of our Bucks County leaders, in opposing the Elkhorn incinerator. I believe that has been stopped. I don't have the latest on that, but that was in 2019, 2020.
I think it was stopped.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Please go on. And then last year, we actually had two events for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And I was not at this one with Dr. Oppenheimer and Sivan Karta. I don't know if, Bob, you want to say anything about it, but let me just mention the other event we had. We called it No Wars, No Waste, No Warming, because we were joined by Danielle Allura. I don't know if Danielle is here, but Danielle is a member of CFPA, has worked actively with us and she was nominated and won to be Miss Earth Pennsylvania. And as Miss Earth Pennsylvania, what you have to do in the Miss Earth contest, unlike others, is have a platform, because it's run by the UN Environmental Program. And her platform was no excuse for single-use plastic. And she's gotten many hotels and other businesses to stop using those little single-use plastic bottles. So I want to commend Danielle, who was there. Do you want to say something about the Dr. Oppenheimer event?
Yes, that was a very successful event. It occurred on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day in 2020. And we were honored and excited to have two such prestigious speakers. Professor Oppenheimer is quoted frequently in major media, the New York Times and others, because he's on the UN panel that has been at the forefront of fighting against and sounding the alarm about the climate crisis. And Dr. Kartha is associated with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and is an expert on that is an issue as well that the Bulletin has started to emphasize. So we'll be talking more about the intersectionality of those two issues as we go forward with tonight's speaker.
And our most recent campaign is opposing the LNG export terminal in Gibbstown, New Jersey. I won't go into all of the details, but you see the dangers and the risks that can happen with LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. So Nikki has provided these actual pictures of explosions from LNG and LPG. LPG is liquefied petroleum gas. What happens is they put the gas at ultra cold temperatures in tank cars. They could be on trucks or railroad tank cars, and they go across the landscape. What happens in our area is that they go from the fracking fields with the gas, where they load the gas, liquefy it, load it on the trains. The train would go across. This hasn't happened yet, thank goodness. The train would go across 200 miles of Pennsylvania and cross over to New Jersey, either in Bucks County or in Philadelphia, right in the middle of Philadelphia, across, as a matter of fact, across the Fairmount Avenue Bridge, across from the Philadelphia Art Museum, all the way across central Philadelphia and through Fairmount and Fair Hill neighborhood, which is there's a group there called Philly Boricuas, which means Puerto Rican in the Carib language. And the Philly Boricuas have been instrumental in opposing this, as well as the Delaware River Keeper Network. And we had a presentation by Tracy Carluccio, who was excellent, from Delaware River Keeper on that. And the last thing I want to mention now is what we're calling, or what he called, the sky's the limit. So many of you are familiar with Bill McKibben, the co-founder of 350.org. And by the way, 350.org has also been involved in the LNG protests and campaign. And McKibben had an article just yesterday in the New Yorker. I would really recommend it. But in that article, he detailed a report from the London-based think tank Carbon Tracker. And perhaps we'll hear more about that from Dr. Pacala, I don't know. But until just a few years ago, solar and wind power were derided by opponents because they were, quote, too expensive and they would take jobs from the oil fields. What this report shows is that has shifted, and it says, quote, so quickly and so dramatically that most politicians are now living on a different planet than the one we inhabit. In other words, people who have accepted the reality of solar and wind and other clean energy sources. They add, with current technology, we can capture at least 6,700 petawatt hours from solar and wind, more than 100 times what our current global energy demand is right now. Another objection is solar arrays actually use, that too much land will be used by solar arrays. McKibben says, no, actually they will use less land than it takes for mining, fracking, and drilling under the old fossil fuels. Also, prices for solar energy have fallen so fast over the last 3 years that 60% of that potential is already economically viable. Ironically, McKibben adds, this evolution took place by coincidence during the administration of Mr. Trump, even as he, quote, ranted about how solar wasn't strong enough and was very, very expensive. So Trump's opinion was probably formed about 20 years ago, because a lot has changed since then. So in summary, I would say that there is a tremendous potential. I think Dr. Pacala will tell us a lot more detail. And I hope that if you are interested in working on this with us, you will contact Nikki Van Aller or myself and volunteer or tell us what you can do to help. So thanks very much. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Pacala.
Well, thank you, Ed. And speaking of Nikki, in addition to being our assistant director for a little over 3 years now, Nikki is also the co-leader of this No Wars, No Warming campaign under our umbrella. And so we're very pleased that she'll be introducing our speaker, but also even during Dr. Pacala's talk, if you think of a question you want to ask, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and Nikki will see that. No one else will see it. We found that to be a more efficient way. And then we'll go through as many of those questions after his talk as we can. So with that, Nikki, please introduce our keynote speaker of the evening.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I really want to thank Dr. Stephen Pacala for joining us tonight, for accepting our invitation to speak. We had been seeing, the Net Zero America project come up in the New York Times, Washington Post, and a lot of other places. And we were really excited to invite someone from that project who's involved in that work to speak, since it seems to be something we need to be engaging with. Dr. Pacala is a professor at Princeton of ecology and evolutionary biology. And then beyond the Net Zero America study, and I think he's going to go into this tonight, he's headed a recent report on accelerating decarbonization of the US energy system, which to my understanding looks more into social dynamics and policy to implement the Net Zero America proposals. Overall, we're really glad to hear from someone who is devoted to this research on carbon mitigation and essentially devoted to our future. And I'll hand it over to him now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to get started right away. Let me see if I can figure out the screen share.
I might have to make you, oh, good.
No, I'm good, I
Great.
think. Everybody see that? And let me go to full screen on it. All right, so what I'm going to do today is actually a hybrid. I'm going to tell you about some of the work that Nikki talked about, and in particular, the results of a National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and National Academy of Medicine co-study that I chaired over the last year to provide the federal government with a policy manual for the US transition to net zero emissions, and which was released in February 2nd of this year, and has been used extensively in the announcements that you've heard from the current administration. I've given probably between 50 and 100 briefings on the Hill and in the executive branch about all of that. But before I do that, because this is a group dedicated to the eradication of nuclear war, or the possibility of nuclear war, I thought I'd just offer, I am a professor after all, and I thought I'd offer you a primer on the relationship between human conflict and climate change. And this comes from a course I teach annually. I read everything that I could about this subject about 5 years ago and went into it thinking that it was going to be mostly anecdotal, and came out shocked that there's the capacity, the delivered capacity for quantitative risk assessment here. And already the risks of conflict from climate change are eye-popping. A prelude to the primer is that there is a widely respected now scientific literature that can attribute individual extreme weather events like heat events and droughts and that sort of thing to climate change. And so we know that a lot of these extremes that afflict us, I mean, most people know that the weather is weird now, right? And one of the main reasons that the US population has changed its opinion about climate change really pretty dramatically. I mean, it's not done yet, but large majorities now accept that it's occurring, is because they recognize the strange weather just outside their home. And so I want to talk about the relationship between these kinds of extreme weather events and human conflict. And then the second part of it is what can we do about it inside the US at least? I'm not going to be talking internationally. I'm going to stick pretty much to this National Academy script, which comes from, which used extensively the Net Zero America project that Nikki talked about and that I founded about 2.5 years ago, primarily to provide the raw material for the kind of policy manual that then we ultimately wrote. So the primer consists of studies, case studies from antiquity. And when I went into this subject, that's what I thought we would find, is a lot of case studies from antiquity and modern case studies, where there was a lot of talk about all kinds of things cause conflict, and climate change is only one of them. It's a force multiplier. These have been going on, particularly case studies in antiquity, for well over 100 years. So I'm just going to give you a smattering of these, give you a flavor for it. And then what I want to do is to shift to what I call modern high-end statistical modeling. And here refers to sample size. Sample sizes of thousands of conflicts that are then analyzed by econometric methods to figure out how much elevated the risk is because of extreme weather events caused by climate change. Now, the statistical arguments in this high-end statistical modeling are not causation. They're correlation, but they do often point to a smoking gun. I have this airplane in the lower right-hand corner. I think it's a mosquito bomber from World War II. A statistician named Weld during World War II was asked to analyze returning bombers to figure out where they ought to put armor on the bombers. And this is his composite picture showing where all the holes were in returning bombers. And when they asked him what they should armor, he said everything that doesn't have a bullet hole in it. And it's because, of course, of observer bias, one of the big problems with inferring causation from statistical correlation. All of the bombers that were hit in the cockpit, on the engines, or behind that rear turret never came home. All right, so that's a little prelude. All right, so I've got a bunch of different cases here, and this is a hodgepodge. You're not really supposed to be able to read this graph. The one in the upper left-hand corner is from Pacala. It's a classic Maya study. The gray areas, the gray things in the upper left-hand figure are
Dr. Pacala, you just went on mute.
Okay, I'm back again. The gray things are droughts, and the blue bars show that the civil conflict and collapses each time there was a drought. I don't know if anybody can recognize, if you haven't been to Tikal, I recommend going. These are pyramids sticking out of the Mesoamerican rainforest. This image, if no one recognizes it, actually comes from, let's see if I can get it to come up, Star Wars: The New Hope. That is the Millennium Falcon, and it's the last image that was the last scene, which was in fact filmed in Tikal. The next example I have is the upper right-hand figure, B, where again, droughts were correlated with the collapse of the civilization that built Angkor Wat. The third one I have on C is a case in which droughts were responsible for civil conflict throughout Chinese history. The next one is a pre-Inca civilization on the banks of Lake Titicaca that collapsed repeatedly because of drought. The next one is the Akkadian Empire. That's the royal standard of Ur, in case you don't recognize it. It's a beautiful piece of artwork that's from 4 millennia ago. The second largest drought in Syrian history occurred just as the Akkadian Empire collapsed. The most severe drought in Syrian history occurred at the beginning of the current civil war. These four-wheeled carts, this is just a little piece of vine candy, are being pulled by equids, but those aren't horses. This is before the horse. Those are actually onagers, neither donkeys nor horses. It's another equid. If you look closely, they all have muzzles on because they are really, really mean, and that's why no one uses them anymore. And finally, I've got this case here, which shows cold events in gray, right? Cold periods in gray were responsible for Mongol invasions throughout Chinese history. So there are all these different case studies in antiquity. And if you start reading this literature, it just goes on and on and on and on. There are current people. There's one guy at the Institute for Advanced Study right now who studies this sort of thing now. There's another guy in the history department here who studies it for the Anatolian Peninsula and so on. There are modern case studies as well. One of the best ones comes from the Arab Spring. This is an image of one of the protests during the Arab Spring. Happened in 2011. These are the countries that were involved. And right before the Arab Spring, there were worldwide crop failures that caused food prices to spike to an all-time high. Wheat in particular went from $4 a bushel to $9 a bushel in a half a year. And that turns out to be really significant in this region. The crop failures were in turn caused by a drought in China, wildfires in Russia, extreme precipitation in Canada, and winter cold in the US. It says here, as yet, no formal attribution to fossil emissions. That's now changed. And several of these driving events have been attributed to climate change using the modern methods of climate attribution. Global wheat demand was temporarily greater than supply. And the countries in the Middle East and North Africa are the largest importers of cereals. Oops, sorry. The graph down here shows the fraction of income that each one of these countries in the region, the average person spent on staples. And the numbers are disturbingly close to 50%. So when staples more than double in price, it means all of a sudden you can't feed your children. There is a well-established correlation, statistical correlation, between food price spikes and rebellion that goes back to the French Revolution. There's a database about all these things. And in fact, there is a relationship. This is one of the first ever relationships published like this that shows that when food price spikes occur, up or on the right-hand side, social unrest follows. This is a threat multiplier. It's an increase in risk, not a single cause. The rebellion leaders in the Arab Spring weren't starving, all right? They had all kinds of other political reasons for this. But in fact, this triggering event more than doubled the risk of civil unrest. The Syrian war was similar, but not quite the same. The Syrian war began in 2011 when Assad's forces fired on a protest in Dara. Syria was in the midst of the worst recorded drought in history. It's been looked at several times and linked to climate change. There has now been a modern attribution study. As I said, this is the worst drought in history. The previous one collapsed the Akkadian Empire 4,000 years ago. In northeast Syria, 75% total crop failure, 85% of livestock dead, 800,000 people lost their livelihoods, 2 to 3 million thrown into extreme poverty, 1 million became food insecure, 200,000 moved to Aleppo, and 500,000 moved to cities Syria-wide. And of course, now we have 500,000 dead. There was a refugee crisis that came from this. You all remember the haunting images. There was an increase in terrorism and anti-Muslim populism in Europe and the United States. Now, these are anecdotes, and the Syrian civil war and the Arab Spring are pretty compelling anecdotes, but it's still useful to ask, how much do these events actually increase the risk of conflict? And this is where high-end statistical modeling comes in. The first comprehensive database was established a little over 10 years ago. And it's the Social Conflict in Africa database, which includes over 6,000 instances of conflict going back 20 years. And one of the first things that was done is that people started to regress the percent increase in conflict, the chance of conflict, using this database as a function of how unusual the weather was. And in this case, it's rainfall. And what this graph shows is that if rainfall is too high or too low, you get 100% increase in conflict. So a doubling of the risk of conflict. Since that time, the statistical methods have improved dramatically. Rather than looking at cross-sectional analyses that compare all kinds of different countries and pool them all together, these analyses look at trends within each individual country and look at the temporal trends within a country, which controls for cultural differences among the countries, to look to see collectively then in all countries simultaneously, how much does climate influence the local risk of war. And the single most impressive person in this business, in my opinion, is a guy named Solomon Shang, H-S-I-A-N-G at Berkeley, who we're trying right now to recruit here. He published the best paper to look at, if you're going to look at anything, is a 2013 paper in the journal Science by Solomon Shang. And one of the first things he did was he looked at the risk of conflict in Africa, East Africa here, Sub-Saharan Africa, and this is the global tropics, as a result of just odd changes in temperature. Massive, large warming spikes locally increase the risk of conflict by more than a factor of 2. And he's since gone on to build a gigantic literature like this. This graph is far too busy to show, to explain completely, but there are a lot of interesting things here. Risks of conflict, risks of conflict onset, risks of civil war, risk of a leader exit, risk of violent events, all of them related to different kind of climate events, and many of them having to do with rainfall deviations. Now, it shouldn't be too surprising then that if you pool all this stuff together, you get some interesting numbers. The Burke et al. Study showed that in sub-Saharan Africa, the predicted climate change by 2030, within 10 years, using historical trends, could increase the annual incidence of war by 54%. Here is another one that looks at violent crime in the United States. Predicted climate change between 2010 and 2099 increases total crime cases by 180,000 for rape, 22,000 for murder, and 2.3 million for aggregated assault. There's a lot of work trying to diagnose why these effects are so strong. The explanations are relatively generic, I think. Hardship from the weather makes the cost ratio benefit of conflict less than that of business as usual for at least one group. In other words, when things get terrible for you, sometimes it's easier to act up than continue to sit and take it. Harsh weather weakens the state's capacity to suppress violence. And then, of course, there's weather-induced migration and weather-induced urbanization, which concentrates poor people, some of whom can become radicalized. So that's my little primer. I'm going to just skip over those in the interests of time and turn to this. All right, so what I'm going to be telling you about now is the first of two reports from a combined committee, a study of the National Academies, U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on accelerating decarbonization of the U.S. energy system. And it was designed to create a policy manual for the federal government to drive our emissions all the way as a nation to net zero. I'll also be using some examples from the Net Zero America project at Princeton. Now, many of you probably know that to limit climate change to substantially less than 2 degrees, global emissions have to reach net zero by mid-century. All right, the science on this is really pretty settled at this point. You don't even need a model, in fact. You can use historical trends to come up to this conclusion robustly. The line here shows what this would look like in the United States. The historical emissions in the United States are this black line. Here we are now, and a drop all the way to a net of zero in a linear ramp is the kind of trajectory we're talking about. Blue represents CO2 emissions. That's the dominant greenhouse gas, which you get from combusting fossil fuels. The orange represents non-CO2 greenhouse gases. Primary sources are methane from a bunch of different agricultural and fossil sources. CH4 is the primary constituent of natural gas, and N2O, which comes from fertilizer. And because some of these emissions are too expensive or disruptive to mitigate, the idea is that we can balance residual emissions at the end by negative emissions, carbon sinks, so that the net of what's left over is zero. The negative emissions plus the positive emissions cancel one another. In the United States, we're blessed with a large carbon sink, a lot of it caused by the regrowing forest, eastern deciduous forest, east of the Mississippi River, which currently supplies, in total, the US sink supplies around 700 million metric tons of CO2 negative emission annually. And so this is what I mean when I say reaching net zero. We don't stop emitting altogether. What we do is we stop net emissions. And this is for the United States. And of course, to reach a temperature, to limit the temperature to substantially less than 2 degrees, we'd have to do this globally. Now, some of you may wonder, how does this relate to the Biden pledge? In this Academy's report, what we say is, look, we want to get to zero by 2050. Here we are now. The Biden plan just came out with a statement that they want to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, which sounds a lot faster, right? So 2030 is a third of the way to 2050. We say we should be about a third of the way down. Biden says we want to get to 50% reduction by 2030. That's what's been called for by many groups, including Bill McKibben's, or even faster. But if you actually superimpose the Biden pledge on the one that we've got, it's the same deal. And that's because that announcement uses 2005 as the starting condition, whereas we talk about it starting from today. In general, the Biden plan is entirely congruent with what we have proposed, which is, of course, not an accident. All right, so this report's scope is on federal actions over the next 10 years to put the US on, and I want to emphasize this, a fair and equitable path to net zero in 2050. This is the only plan out there that both provides a technical blueprint and the policies that would enact it. So to build all the hardware, to install all the wind and solar and so on necessary to get there, but that also provides an equally detailed and equally costly plan to make sure that the transition is both fair and equitable. The fairness and the equitability of the plan, I think, are the primary determinants of its success. On the one hand, we have the the damages from fossil pollution having fallen historically and currently today disproportionately on historically marginalized groups. And that can't be allowed to continue. Also, as we go forward, it's true that these plans create a lot of jobs, but they also throw a lot of people out of work. And we need to do something for those people and not just recreate what we've done in the past in the United States and throw all the legacy workers under the bus. And so at least half of the work we did was in the social sciences of building a fair and equitable path. The sectors are CO2 from transportation, electricity, industry, buildings, and biofuels. There's some other disclaimers and stuff here. The report was, although it's compatible to say the least with the announcements from the Biden administration, it was developed independently of the Biden administration. The committee's roster included technical experts and energy policy experts, but half the people are social scientists and others and practitioners who are labor experts, who are experts on technological transitions of the past and the policies that work for them, people who are experts on environmental justice and practitioners in environmental justice, and so on. So it was for me a pretty heavy lift because I was operating far from my area of core sort of academic expertise. What I want to do is to go through some of the key findings and recommendations in the report. We read just about everything that's been written and took testimony from everything that's in the works. And some of the results are pretty interesting and were surprising even to us. The first is the one that Ed just talked about. Deep decarbonization is both feasible and economic. The blue line in this figure shows the proportion of US GDP that the nation has spent historically on its energy. And then of course it ends, well, the last number we have here is 29, well, I guess that's 2020. And then the extrapolations to the right are alternative plans for getting to net zero. And the punchline here is that the cost of getting to net zero in terms of the fraction of US GDP over the next 30 years is less than the fraction we've spent on energy over the previous 30 years. And the reason for that is the spectacular drop in alternatives, as Ed said, and as I'll mention in just a minute. You may have, and incidentally, this cost, which amounts cumulatively during the 2020s to $200 billion, that's $20 billion a year, is much smaller than even the added health benefits from closing the coal plants alone. Just that benefit more than pays for the transition. This cost now is actually too small to reliably calculate. I should also say that our report was for the full transition, but focused on actions over the next 10 years, since it's a policy manual and the policy needs to be implementable and active today. You may have heard that these plans cost trillions, and it's important to understand where that number comes from. It's actually just a number that's designed to show how serious people are. It's true that the transition costs about $2 trillion in incremental capital, but this isn't a cost. Wind and solar provide the lowest levelized cost of electricity of any sorts, not because they have the lowest capital cost. It's because they have the lowest operating cost. Once you build wind and solar, you don't have to pay for fuel to generate electricity the way you have with a fossil plant. And so it's the operating plus the capital cost that determines the actual cost. And the $2.1 trillion, the $1 trillion numbers you hear, that's capital required, not what it actually costs the nation. This just shows the spectacular decline in wind and solar. In the last 10 years alone, solar has declined in price by 90%. That is, every 3 years it halves. Wind has declined by 70%, and lithium-ion batteries used in electric cars have declined by 85%. The reason is, of course, public policy. We subsidized, not just the United States, the entire world subsidized wind and solar for a period of about 50 years, created markets for wind and solar before it was cost competitive. Firms competed with one another on price and drove the cost down. It's capitalism. It really is the triumph of subsidies, energizing and enabling capitalism. This graph just shows the drop from 1975 to 2015 in the cost of solar from $101 per installed watt to 61 cents. And now, of course, it's substantially lower than that. I've done a zillion briefings on the Hill, and I can tell you that when the doors closed, I have never heard a single person from either party say this transition is going to be too expensive. Everybody knows it isn't anymore. If you hear somebody say that on the news, it's grandstanding. A second lesson learned is that decarbonization policies must assure a fair and equitable transition with public participation in decision-making. The academic and other literature on this shows that unless you engage people in consultation and in planning, and unless this is a diverse group rooted locally, you end up with trouble, like this yellow vest movement in France last year protesting the spike in fuel prices caused by climate action. So we need to do this for ethical reasons, but we also need to do this because it's going to be impossible to sustain a transition unless we prevent groups from becoming angry because they felt marginalized. This graph simply shows that Black and Asian or Pacific Islander populations are disproportionately exposed to air pollution. This is something that's widely reported now. And this is part of the environmental justice that people, frankly, aren't going to stand for anymore if we're going to swap our energy system for another one. A third lesson learned is that the transition could revitalize US manufacturing and increase employment. There are a lot of studies on how employment would increase. Energy jobs would increase. The median is about 1 to 2 million over the next decade because wind and solar are more intensive of jobs than solar or than fossil. But that isn't the whole story. All right. And Bill McKibben, bless him, he's right, but he's also wrong. Because this is a very busy graph. This comes from the Net Zero America Project. It's the only thing like it. The Net Zero America Project was an engineering study of a half a dozen different alternative net zero energy systems and their transitions that looked at a 6-kilometer grid. Like, you can look at Princeton, New Jersey and see what we think it would look like. In 2031 and 2032 and 2050 and so on. How much capital needs to be invested, how much revenue would be generated by what's installed, but also how many people are going to be employed, what they're likely to earn and what they're likely to do, what the health impacts are likely to be, all that sort of thing. This is a graph of energy employment alone for each of the 50 states. And you're not supposed to be able to read this. What you're supposed to be able to see is that almost all the graphs, you look at a state and they're all going up. That's Bill McKibben's story. Everybody gets an increase in jobs, but not everybody. Wyoming gets a decrease in jobs. North Dakota gets a decrease in jobs. Oklahoma gets a decrease in jobs. Texas, interestingly, gets an increase from expansion of wind and solar, followed by a decrease when the fossil collapses. Louisiana gets a net decrease. I don't know if I said this. West Virginia gets an initial decrease from the collapse in coal jobs. And these people are real people and they earn good wages. And so there isn't enough wind and solar employment locally to compensate for the high-paying fossil jobs in areas of high fossil job concentration. And so what to do about this? This is the biggest issue on the Republican side of the aisle right now. And it's also an enormous issue in the center. Joe Manchin's group has been in contact with us repeatedly about this decline in jobs in West Virginia right there. And you know how important his vote is likely to be. And so over the next year, before the second National Academies report, we really want to look at this in detail to figure out whether or not it's possible to do proactive job creation, perhaps by creating zero carbon industrial hubs in communities currently rich in fossil jobs. Again, many more communities are going to gain than lose. Most places don't have a fossil electric power plant right now, but every community is going to have lots of wind and solar generators of electricity and get local revenues from them. Many of them perhaps owned by local governments. There is a widespread possibility for local governments to install wind and solar on municipal lands and use the revenues to pay for local services, which would then decrease the need for taxes. But nonetheless, we're going to have to do something, I think, about the displaced fossil workers. The recommendations, specific policy recommendations from our report, are found in a single table. The table is reconfigurable by goal. There are icons that summarize each of the goals, from cost effectiveness to promoting and protecting communities to electrifying transportation and home heating. Each row in the table is a separate policy. There are 30 separate policies. Again, the table shows what goals the policy would meet, is intended to meet, what agency and government is responsible for it, how much it would cost, and a whole bunch of other things. And if you want to learn what's in this report, just download this table, 15 minutes from it, and you won't have to read the full 250-page thing. I'm going to go through just a couple of these. First one here is that we need a US CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions budget that gets to net zero by 2050. And this needs to be by sector and by gas, so we know where we're going. We don't have one yet. This doesn't cost much. It's not enough, close to enough by itself, but unless we have an agreed upon target, we're not going to get there. We controversially propose that the US should enact a price on carbon, an economy-wide price of $40 per ton. $40 a ton is, we think, a Goldilocks number. It's small enough that the economics literature let me back up. I'm getting that was going to get convoluted. $40 a ton is a number that's not large enough to pay for the whole transition, because you have to do some of the expensive things early as high-priced capital assets that have long lifetimes age out. If we replace cement plants by another emitting cement plant 50 years from now, it's still emitting. So you'd have to mothball it early, and that's expensive. So you need a pretty high price on carbon. But if you put the price on carbon that high, there is no literature about who's going to be damaged. We won't be able to identify workers for whom that would be an unfair burden. The literature on mitigating those kinds of burdens tops out at around $40 a ton. And so that's where we put the number. We did this because of this dark piggy bank here. This is the most cost-effective thing you can do. If you don't do this, the transition is considerably more expensive, and you don't have as much money to spend on everything else. Now, with that said, because this is politically unlikely, and because the $40 a ton won't do the whole thing, we call for a bunch of standards that are entirely in line with that are the same as what Biden just proposed, or almost the same. Zero emissions electricity, we say 75% in 2030. Zero emissions vehicles, 50% of sales in 2030. Zero emissions manufacturing standards for home heating, cooking, and cooling appliances. And these standards would ensure that we do the transition, stay on the transition, even without the tax, right? Even without the price on carbon. Our program to promote a fair and equitable transition starts with 10 regional centers. It turns out that regional planning really needs to be done regionally because different regions in the country have different concerns. Those regional centers would be places where mayors and governors and House of Representatives people and state officials would meet to find out what is coming. And they would be then the deliverers of community block grants for analysis and planning. Block grants that also have requirements for community involvement. So it's not just one sector of the community that does the analysis and planning. We call for an extension service like the Ag Extension Service from the Department of Energy to provide technical expertise and know-how for this community block planning process. And so a community can figure out what are the challenges are that it faces. Is it going to lose its dominant employer, for instance? Having done so, the primary distributor of aid that can mitigate those harms is an independent national transition corporation, which is endowed and funded once, right, as an independent corporation, independent of the federal government. We have prior examples in US history of this sort of thing, and it's really the only way to get the kind of longevity that is required in a 30-year transition. There's an extensive education and training program, and then there's a White House Office of Equitable Energy Transitions to oversee the whole thing and make sure that it is working and to course correct if it isn't. Now, the Biden plan right now is great on the technical stuff, and it's great on the rhetoric around the fairness and the equitability, but it doesn't have the level of detail, perhaps, that I think is still needed. So that's all I have right now for you. I think I'm just at 35 minutes, given where we started, and so I'd be happy now to turn to questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Pacala. I thought that was really outstanding. Yes, let's give a hand to Dr. Pacala. That was a really outstanding overview, and it gives me a lot of hope. So I'm really appreciative of everything you shared. Nikki, do we have a question you can start with?
Yeah, there are definitely some questions, and feel free to keep putting those in the chat as we go. The one thing that I'm getting a lot and that I've got before this presentation even is the question about is this enough? Is 2050 enough? And I was wondering if you get a lot of pushback or debate around that, and does it interfere with your work, or do you think people are mostly working together? What does that look like?
Yeah, so in the Academy's work, we were actually, you have a task, you're delivered a task. When you're asked to chair an Academy study, I've done a bunch of these, they hand over a task and they say, will you do this? And you can't negotiate what's in it. There's a yes or no answer, all right? So I say yes, right? It's public service. So the why, and so that's where 2050 comes from. Now, if you ask me as a scientist, what should the target be? I'd say, well, the science says that CO2, excess CO2 in the atmosphere is dangerous. Number one, dangerous right now. I mean, we know it is, right? We know that it's increasing extreme weather and killing people and that sort of thing. We also know that the damage function is concave up, meaning that damages accelerate. The bad news is that every year you wait, the expected damages are worse next year than they were this year. And when you stop, unless you pump the CO2 back down in the atmosphere again, it kind of stays the same for a long time. Not quite, but close enough. And so then the question is, where should we stop? All right. As far as the science knows, there is no critical tipping point that would happen with a 2050 net zero target for the globe. We don't get close to one of these tipping points to the extent that we understand them. All right, so there's no sort of magic horrible thing that happens if we, at 2050, at least that we know of. We think there's a bit of cushion there. And so then the question is, well, what does it cost to do the transition? And 2050 is a cost minimum because of the longevity of our capital stock. A fossil power plant lasts about 30 years. And so that gives you enough time to replace obsolete equipment that has aged out with a non-emitting alternative, which is far cheaper than scrapping a whole bunch of stuff that we've just built. And I'm concerned about all the other things that we need to do as a society, all the all the children's health and all the other things that are in Biden's family plan right now. And so costs matter to me for those reasons, right? Now, if somehow there was a groundswell to get this done by 2035, I'd say Yahoo, although I think as a technical matter, it might be impossible, okay? Maybe with a World War II mobilization, you might do it. So that's where I am with it, Nikki. As a scientist, I don't know that a catastrophe is coming. In fact, all of the evidence says that the catastrophe is beyond emitting past 2050. And so I can live with a 2050 target, especially because we have so many other needs for money in our society and around the world.
Thank you for that answer.
Nikki, go ahead.
Yeah, going back to in terms of conflict and those relationships, and thank you for going over that so thoroughly with us. And it might be a hard question to answer, but do you think that, we're going to prevent some of that, or that conflicts are just going to get worse in the next 30, 50 years before they get better?
So the terrible thing about CO2 is that when you put it in the atmosphere, a substantial fraction of it stays there for centuries, okay? And that means if it were just that simple, when we get to net zero emissions, we would freeze atmospheric CO2 at the highest level in human history, and then suffer every year the worst year of damages that we could create. All right. Now, it's not quite that bad. It turns out that there are natural sinks in the ocean and land biosphere that will continue to operate with inertia because, in scientific terms, they're currently way out of equilibrium. And we could talk about that if somebody has a specific technical question about it. The important thing is that once we hit net zero, they will continue to operate and slowly draw the atmospheric CO2 down. So if we hit net zero at about 2050 on a linear ramp, the CO2 concentration will be at about 450 or 440 parts per million. It's currently at about 410, 15. And it'll drive itself down by 75 ppm over the next 150 years and get us almost to Bill McKibben's 350.org target of 350 parts per million. So the natural world will still save us to some extent. Will extra conflicts be inevitable? Well, they're already occurring now, according to a pretty compelling academic literature. And each year, because the CO2 concentration goes up, they're going to be worse than they were the year before. And then they're going to stay stuck there for a long time. So yeah, we're going to have to endure a lot.
Nikki, is there a next question?
Yeah, there's plenty. Trying to kind of combine some of them. I'm getting a few questions about needing to make this a global priority and where we fit into that. And also like in terms of equity, like that the US should be doing more because it's only fair because we emit more. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do as a citizen of the world, as a scientist. A lot of my the discipline is silent on many of those matters. The thing is that we're the largest historical emitter and the second largest current emitter, right? And one of the largest per capita emitters, much higher per capita emitter than China. Concepts of national as opposed to personal responsibility are difficult. And I think those should be the topic of debates in organizations like yours. So when a citizen is naturalized in the United States, does she automatically assume the legacy of historical emissions in the United States? and the responsibility for them? Questions like that. Here's what I think. If I were emperor of the world, I would start paying for the transition in developing countries now. But as a citizen of the world, I fear that those kinds of north-south wealth transfers are unlikely. What I do believe, though, is that if the US transitions with alacrity, and it really looks like the Biden administration wants to, intends to, then we will drive down the cost even further, all right? And so the goal here is to drive down the costs of the alternative non-emitting energy system so far that the cheapest thing that developing societies can do is to install the non-emitting stuff, so that there isn't some devil's choice between preventing climate change and pulling their people out of poverty right now. And so investing here will help globally, even if there aren't large transfers of wealth from north to south.
Got
Thank
some
you.
more, Nikki?
Yep. Got a few questions about kind of the response to your work. I think in terms of the meetings that you're having, the briefings that you're giving, what the response is to that.
So the response in the executive branch is uniformly positive, and the thing that interests everybody the most are the diversity and equity and fairness pieces, because those have become essential. I mean, it's been remarkable how quickly it's become impossible to talk about climate change and its solution without talking about diversity and equity and fairness. And we've got the only sort of policy portfolio about that. We've also, I've spoken and briefed environmental justice groups and some groups that are on the fringe, on the green fringe, and there is also widespread support, with the understanding that if they had their say, they'd want to go faster. All right. But the EJ groups, for instance, just love the fact that we're spending so much emphasis, devoting so much emphasis to environmental justice. In Congress, it's also really interesting in testimony where people get a chance to just try to make you look bad. It's mostly pretty lame. And when you start talking about the need to do something for displaced fossil workers, it's impossible for Republicans to object to that, all right? It's not the case that without any of this action, fossil workers won't be displaced. Coal jobs have been disappearing now for decades, and it's a national tragedy, and so that's going to continue. And so there is widespread acknowledgement that if you care about everybody who could be harmed by this, no matter what their current job is, you do get a fair hearing on that side of things. And as I said, nobody says anymore, oh, this is going to be too costly behind closed doors, because it isn't, right? The pushback when it comes from the policy prescriptions that include standards that sound like and are engineering an economy, all right? Standards for renewable energy are, economic engineering, and seem Stalinist, right, to some on the right.
And kind of related in terms of the public, how can we get more people on board when there's still a good chunk of the population that doesn't think that humans are causing climate change, and get away from the however true or not it is, like the rhetoric of cost and losing lots of jobs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done. And so this planning process that we've talked about is designed to enshrine in every local community a discussion so that most communities will discover that in fact their revenues are going to increase and that their employment is going to increase more than 90%. All right, that'll help a lot. On the communications side, even in Princeton, there's an organization called Climate Central. It's one of the best climate communication organizations out there. They have they discovered early on that in red states, a lot of the people get their weather news, especially extreme weather news, from local TV or the local TV website. And it's because the weather is tailored locally. And so they now have partnerships with most of the TV meteorologists in the country and deliver free tailored content about the climate roots of extreme weather. And this gets put on all over the country, even in Sinclair stations and stuff. There was an attempted blowback by Republicans in Congress against them, but the moderate Republicans swatted it down because the organization is nonpartisan. They're gearing up to use the results of the Net Zero America project to supply counter narratives to local people about what's going to happen to their economy. Because the simple story is that most people are going to be better off. There is going to be trouble and organized resistance against from communities where there's a high concentration of fossil workers. And I understand why. Those people are scared they're going to lose their jobs because they are. And the question is, as a society, can we, for the first time, create alternatives that are not just getting retrained and moving, but actually alternatives that might be stay in my own place and get a job that is, a paying job like the one I've come to depend on. And so I think there's the opportunity to do something about this. And I even think that that portion of the transition after the first tranche gets through Congress, if it does, as part of the infrastructure bill, that action could be bipartisan. Because as I said, it's awfully difficult even for a Republican to be against that, right? Let's help the fossil workers.
More, Nikki? I see Ed has one in the chat box too, but go ahead.
Ed, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I'm interested in the whole carbon tax question, which I think you stated quite succinctly, but I'm not sure if you stated your whole premise. So let me ask you this. First of all, by the way, I've seen studies from the Stanford Solutions Project and others that say that getting to zero will actually increase clean energy jobs by perhaps 10 million people, whereas we really only have 1 million plus in the fossil fuel industry. So that's one thing. But on the question of carbon tax and fairness, I really agree with you. We need to be fair. If you have a carbon tax, that poor people pay a larger percentage of income on fuel, gas, or whatever than anybody else. That's just a fact. So the only way to have a carbon tax and make it be fair to the population at large, I think, would be to have a dividend, a share of that tax coming back to the taxpayer. Is that, are you in favor of that, or do you have another solution to that problem?
Yeah, so not as a member of the National Academy, not as the chair of the National Academy Group, but as a citizen, I actually do favor an action like a dividend.
Okay.
Whether or not it's 100% dividend or a means tested one, I don't know. But I do favor a dividend. The point I was making about $40 is that we know that if we had 100% dividend, so we return all of the carbon tax to the people, everybody gets the same check. which means that poor people actually make money, typically because rich people use more energy, right?
Right.
The problem is that there are still some poor people who, because of their jobs, because of their commute and their need to have an F-350 pickup truck and that sort of thing as part of their job, that would still have trouble. And if the carbon tax were $100 a ton, which is the number that you'd need to build, CC, carbon capture and storage into alternatives to cement plants and that sort of thing, then we don't know even how to identify those people. All right, so we wouldn't know how to help them. So 100% dividend would still harm a whole bunch of people, and we wouldn't even know who they were. Okay.
So is a price on carbon actually that practical? Wouldn't it be better to tax the fossil fuelers and other polluters?
Well, that's what a carbon tax does. Is it tax the, it has to actually tax the fuel itself, not just the polluters, for it to work. The issue is that if you have a bunch of standards, the costs of some materials will go up. The ones that are particularly expensive to mitigate, like the cost of cement will go up, all right, beyond what the carbon tax would cover. Look, let's face it, there's not going to be a carbon tax in this iteration of the Biden administration, I don't think. And so this is going to be done with standards and incentives.
I think you're right.
Yeah, that's right.
Nikki, back to you. More questions in the queue?
There are a lot of questions. I don't think we're gonna get to them all.
Anyone that strikes you that you want to lift up?
Yeah, one that's interesting is thinking about things from the state level and possibly helping states with like how to go forward with implementation. They gave an example that the New Jersey legislature is looking at a pilot program for electric school buses, but people don't know what it exactly involves. And it helped them to get information from a similar program in Massachusetts. So just that general idea of should states be waiting for more information and detail, or what would be best?
Yeah, first of all, we focused on federal actions in this first iteration, but we're going to be focusing on state actions also in the second. The second thing is that even so, a lot of the programs would be administered through the states because that works effectively inside the United States. On the specific matter of where states might get technical expertise, that's one of the reasons we think the Department of Energy should offer a service so that you can in fact get the technical expertise you need to make intelligent decisions about stuff like electric school buses. Electric school buses, of course, are in the Biden plan, right? That's in the infrastructure plan. So if I were a state, I'd be just waiting for the money to arrive, right? And start in. Actions inside the states, a lot of states are really going to make off like bandits. You know, one of the first groups that responded when we released the Net Zero America study was Senator Manchin and his staff. And there, of course, the concern was for a guy who's a swing Democrat vote, but whose state is going to lose coal workers. You know, what does he do? And, you know, one of the interesting things is that West Virginia is a fantastic state for wind power. Per capita, it's one of the highest. If you look at it in absolute terms, it isn't, because it's not a very big state. But if you look at per capita, it's a big state. And if you total up the revenues that come in from the renewable power that needs to be installed in West Virginia, it amounts to roughly $250,000 per year per coal worker who's going to lose a job. Okay. And there is already, has been, as part of the Appalachia development actions during the 1950s and 60s, revenue sharing options for states from power. And so one of the things that he is really interested in is how to capture some of that revenue. It's something like 3 times the current state budget, okay? And so there's no reason that states couldn't see extra sources of revenue here. There's large amounts of state land. The state technically owns the wind that flows across the land and the photons that strike it, all right? And so I think we may have an alternative funding model here that would benefit states.
Great.
Another thing that has come up a couple times in the questions is people are asking how nuclear energy would fit in.
Yeah, so the thing about the transition, why is the transition as inexpensive as it now appears to be? And one of the answers is that, and people don't like this answer, that we have a nuclear and gas power fleet right now. And the gas power fleet can be throttled up and down. And that means that as we install renewables, and there are periods when the wind isn't blowing enough and the sun isn't shining enough over large regions, we have a way to compensate and to firm up that renewable source using our existing fleet that we already paid for. Now, those nuclear plants are being aged out, and it becomes more expensive if we allow them to age out. If I listen to Frank von Hippel's stories about what can happen to, tailings ponds and terrorism, say get rid of them immediately. All right, but nonetheless, we have the gas plants as well, and the nukes supply the same kind of function. Without that, if you tried to go to 100% renewable power by something like 2035, or even zero emitting power by 2035, it's really expensive because you have to replace all of those gas plants and all of the nuclear plants that you're using to firm up the renewable source by non-emitting alternatives when they're only being used for 10% of the electricity or 5% of the electricity that you're using. And so that's a tough one, right? It's much cheaper is if you can replace them as they age out. All right. Again, if I were emperor of the world, I'd probably get rid of all the nukes because I'm worried about proliferation. On the other hand, there are all kinds of new nuclear designs. I don't see it happening in this country in time to make a big dent in it. Nukes are really expensive right now, right? So you build a new nuke, it costs you a fortune. And so, but on the other hand, I'm not sure that it won't be a big part of the solution in China. Frank has forgotten more about this than I've ever learned. And so if you want to know whether or not nukes ought to be part of our future, you ask him. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for answering all the questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We work with Frank a lot. He's wonderful. I do quickly, before we wrap up, just want to give a shout out to the various organizations and groups that co-sponsored this and helped us to promote it. We definitely all benefit from being able to share this widely. So we had the Brandy Wine Peace Community, Maryland Peace Action, Massachusetts Peace Action, Peace Day Philly, Peace Justice Sustainability Now, Penn Environment, Pennsylvania Physicians for Social Responsibility, Resolution Media Fund, the UN Association of Greater Philadelphia, and World Beyond War. And I just want to thank those groups very much for their help.
Good night, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Pacala. And I have just a few closing remarks, but if you need to get off, we certainly understand, Dr. Pacala.
Okay, I'm good.
Really outstanding presentation. We really appreciate it. I just wanted to say in closing that I'd encourage you to go to our website, peacecoalition.org. And we do have a No Wars, No Warming campaign icon on the right. Click on that. You'll find a lot of really great stuff. And we also have a donate button, by the way, because this organizing costs money. And so we'd be very happy to have you make a financial contribution, or at the bottom, you can click to send an email to our office and say you'd like to get actively involved in that campaign. We'd really love to hear from you on that. And one final thing to kind of finish up the No Wars, No Warming that Ed presented at the beginning is we continued that campaign as recently as last Saturday, when we joined with student groups for the encouraging and insisting. Oh, Nikki's got a photo coming up. There it is, the Divest Princeton rally. So this is a great handle. We all have handles that we can strive for, I think, to try to promote getting out of the fossil fuel business and rapidly increasing the speed at which we approach a carbon-free future. So all of these, I think, work together. We were proud to co-sponsor this, had 100 people at it. And Princeton University is probably in the next month or so going to be making a decision about that. I hope for a favorable one. They divested from South Africa. They've done some good things over the years. And so just wanted to let you know that campaign continues. Thanks to all of you for being with us tonight. Oh, one last thing. This was recorded tonight. So another way that you can help us reach more people and get this incredible educational materials that Dr. Pacala has been, I mean, the intellectual brain trust that he is in charge of is just incredible and amazing in my judgment. And it gives me a lot of hope that the know-how, the intellectual heft to kind of get us there exists and is getting stronger with his leadership and many other great scientists as well and experts. So please watch for on our website, again, recent events is where you'll find it. Watch for the recording of this event and send it to your colleagues, send it to your friends, and we would love for you to do that. Again, thank you for spending the time with us tonight. We're ending just a few minutes early, but we try to run a tight ship. And again, thanks to all of you for being here, and especially to Professor Pacala.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks
Good
everybody.
night, everyone.
Good to be here. Good night.
Have a good evening.